Since the dawn of programming, we've been measuring productivity by lines of code and commits, those little green boxes on GitHub. But if we're being honest, we know this isn't the best option, but we also don't always know what else to do. Let's explore moving beyond those green boxes to measure productivity. We're joined today by Eirini. Eirini, thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you very much for having me.
So we continue to measure developer productivity by looking at the little green squares, by looking at lines of code. And I think if we're all being honest, we kind of know that this really isn't the right way. Why isn't that the right way? What's wrong with that approach?
First of all, I'm glad that we're all coming together to realize that that's not the right way. The problem is too narrow in its definition. It doesn't capture what developers do, how they work, how multifaceted their work is. It's an unfair measure, if we're being really honest, because it doesn't represent the goals the developers are trying to achieve. Nobody starts work and saying, today, I'm going to write the most lines of code that I can.
So by measuring somebody by the lines of code, we're incentivizing the wrong thing.
Absolutely. It's an unfair measure to begin with, just because it's ill-defined. Once people know that what they're measured by is lines of code, and that goes for any measurement, honestly, they're now incentivized to behave in a different way. So we just incentivized basically obfuscated code, right? More verbose commits. And I don't think anybody agrees that that's the thing to do. In fact, a lot of the times we have these stories of developers where very valuable commits that they did were actually refactorings and deleting lines of code.
So then what should we be measuring?
What should we be measuring is a really big question. And I think the question that hides behind that is, why is it that we're measuring in the first place? I think the assumption that we're all making, but sometimes we don't say it out loud, so we tend to forget it, is that we are measuring something because we have a problem, we're trying to introduce a solution, and measurements show us whether we're actually improving things or not. So they're a means to an end. We don't need to worship like metrics and measurements. The really big thing then, in terms of understanding why is it that you're measuring, is working your way back into what's the root problem that you're trying to solve, and what goals do you have in terms of how you're going to improve it. Measurements come in later, but if you don't have a good diagnosis of a problem, that's not really going to go anywhere. And then if you don't come in with a goal, metrics only show you numbers and trajectories, but without necessarily going back to improvements and changes that made sense.
So then why should I be measuring?
Because ultimately, we do want to have a sense of whether changes that we're making have an effect. So you do want to measure what is a baseline of speed, quality, performance, sense of flow, satisfaction, all of these holistic dimensions of productivity. You definitely want to have some sort of, what's the level that I'm starting with? And then once you understand the problems that you have, and I love that there's a trend now that companies are actually adopting it more and more, is to ask developers where the problems are.
Along those lines, one of the most common questions that I get asked when people get right down into it is, why aren't my developers more productive?
Ooh.
Hello? Oh, it's Bronte Vanderhorn. Let me put you on speaker.
I hear this question too, Christopher, and I think I really encourage our customers to take a systems perspective to this particular matter. Engineering happens as part of a network of different components. Absolutely, the engineer is a critical part of the complex system of engineering, but there's also so many other factors at play. The tooling the engineers use, the processes that they're being asked to use, cultural factors, roles and responsibilities across the SDLC. All of these things create a system where the engineering is taking place.
Bronte, what's the question we should be asking?
I recommend to organizations get really crisp on what is your goal. What is it that you want to do better in your organization? Then we can become more targeted about what it is that we measure, what makes sense to measure. And we can even have a conversation about what are the most cost-effective ways that enable us to take action. The other benefit of having your goal in mind is that it draws your attention to the fact that Once you've got some indication of how you're currently going in terms of that particular goal, you're actually planning to take some form of action, because assumedly we're wanting to do better, we're wanting to improve. So it reminds us not that this is just going to be about measuring, but we're going to want to actually take some action here and learn from that action as we progress towards that goal.
Thank you for sharing your knowledge, Bronte. What's the one big thing that all teams need to do then to start measuring, to start helping get a sense of developer and engineering productivity?
Step number one is understanding the problem. And the best method to do that is to start talking with developers, surveying them, seeing where the friction points are. Everything else is picking your battles, so picking the problems, coming up with potential solutions, and start measuring after that point to see, after you introduce the changes, do you see improvements? Do you see changes, and are they in the direction that you want? That's where the measurements really shine through, but you have to have done the work before.
So have the conversations, take surveys, listen, and then act upon what you've heard.
Absolutely.
And then go back one more time to ask again to see whether or not you've moved in the right direction.
It's a learning, right? It's a learning. After you've introduced changes, you will see some improvements or some things that didn't go in the direction that you were thinking. Either way, you will see that in your metrics, and you will understand why it is happening from talking with developers. So you need the combination of both things.
Eirini, thank you so very much for joining today.
Thank you very much for having me.
What really stuck out to me about that conversation is the importance of listening to developers, that the quickest way to find out what's impeding productivity is to have conversations, to do surveys, to listen, and then to act. To learn more about how to best measure developer productivity, check out the link, and thanks for joining as we went beyond the commit.